I'm Scott L. Miller. This is my life living in Leon, Nicaragua. This evening, as I'm recording this, the Volcano Telica in Telica, Leon, is erupting and has been for about the last 6 hours. The last count that I saw, there's 67 known eruptions. There are pretty minor ones going on of this volcano, and it is now pretty late at night. We're coming up on 1 o'clock in the morning, and we are feeling our houses shake, and everyone in the area can hear the booms. So a lot of people have questions and worries and concerns about this, so we're going to talk about that today. But before we do, this is the all right, love that bump. Before we dive into today's topic, can we take a moment to talk about this bread? This, I don't have a name for this. I don't know what it is, but I think we can show this. Oh, we can. Look how good that looks. This, first of all, is a standard Nicaraguan bread that I don't know the name of, but we just call it triangle bread. And you may think that this just looks like kind of a dry piece of bread, and it certainly does look that way, but that is not the case. You actually take a bite. The corners are a little bit dry. I'll give you that. You get through that, though, and then you get in here. And really soon, like I said, the corners are a little bit dry. You get in, and there's actually this thin but the perfect amount of cheese with sugar. So it's a sweet cheese filling, which hopefully we're going to be able to see here. I don't know if I can get it to. It does not want to focus on this anymore. You can kind of know, it's just not going to show it to us, but it's like, it helps hold in the moisture. It is so delicious. My wife brought it home, and my daughter tried it, and she and I are both like, this is amazing. I can't believe how good this is. And it's incredible. So this is from the El Dorado Panaderia in downtown Leon. This is a standard bread that's made all over the country. I've never had one that was anywhere near this delicious. El Dorado is famous for being at least the best known, if not the best, panaderia in Leon. But these are incredible. If you're going to be in the area, look for these. If you're in downtown Leon, check out El Dorado. There's always a line, but these are super cheap. We got a big bag of them. I have no idea what we paid, but very cheap, and they are delicious, like really, really good. We just eat them, but they're even better if you put butter on them, but you certainly don't need to. But I come from a culture where we put butter on everything. So that's just how we work. Before we get into the topic, I just want to mention, I'm going to do a short on this as well, but I went to Wing Lovers the other night, and I know people really enjoy finding out what things really cost here. So this is a sit-down restaurant. It's a chicken wing place, and chicken wings, or alitas, as they're called here, or alas, like there's a lot of nicknames for it, are a little bit more like fried chicken. It's a little bit more like a KFC than like a buffalo chicken wing place. They call things buffalo wings here, but they're really fried chicken places, so it's kind of in between. We took 6 people total and had a fried chicken dinner for 6 people with French fries, and everyone got soda. So this is not a fancy place. This is not a fancy type of food. We did not get a great big variety of things. We just got a huge thing of chicken and a bit of French fries and 6 sodas. And for a sit-down restaurant with a good waiter in a nice location downtown in Leon, and dinner for everyone with the drinks, everything tax included, but not the tip, came to $29. So after everything, it was about $32, including a tip. $32 to feed 6 people downtown Leon in a sit-down restaurant, but it was just chicken, right? Fried chicken. So very simple, but everyone really enjoyed it. So just to give you kind of a price of what real world I had. It was not a place I picked. It was not a thing, but that is Wing Lovers in Leon, which is relatively new. So with that, let's get to today's topic, which is the current ongoing, as I'm recording this, eruption of the Volcano Telica. Now what's happening here is we actually have this volcano erupting nonstop. Now these don't erupt that often, but when people hear that a volcano is erupting here in Nicaragua, people really do freak out. And we get a lot of what I find to be strange reactions because, I mean, first of all, we live in the Ring of Fire. So having volcanoes near us and erupting is just part of daily life. We don't actually have them erupt all the time, but we do have them erupt often enough that it's not really a big deal. People don't actually sit around being too concerned about it. And what's really funny is the National Institute in INITER that does the seismic measurements and stuff keeps warning people to stop climbing the volcano. Like, that's how casually people are generally taking this, that it's the middle of the night and they're warning people to not go up the volcano right now while it's erupting and shaking everything in the area. Now, we're quite some distance away from the volcano, and the current status is that they underestimated it quite significantly today, and it is actually a much larger eruption than they thought it was going to be, because they warned about this in the afternoon before any of this really started. So we had warning. No one was caught by surprise who was paying attention. And the thing is, it's bigger than they thought. And so they have now issued an evacuation. We understand they have definitely put out warnings. I've seen those firsthand. I've been told there's an evacuation, but I've not seen that firsthand. And the area that they're warning for is 10 kilometers from the volcano. Now, 10 kilometers actually has a large area that's basically just around all the volcanoes, completely desolate, and then it's kind of like Mordor, and then there's an area of fields around volcanoes. This is just naturally how volcanoes are. Volcanoes are at its cone rather uninhabitable if it's an active volcano. And then a little ways away from that, suddenly you get a lot of really lush farmland because the volcanic ash creates really good growing conditions. So this is just normally what you're going to find. You're going to find this anywhere you have a volcano pretty much, especially in this area. And so you don't have any population near volcanoes, not within that first 1 to 2 kilometers. Pretty much. You'll have a few farmers, but very isolated populations. And those people are extremely aware of what's going on with volcanoes all the time. They're never going to be caught unaware anymore. There was a time period when that was true, but not anymore. Any real village of any size is not located within a danger zone. They may be within an evac zone, but it's a very casual thing. Like, hey guys, you should probably go now, because sometime in the next 20 hours, this could become dangerous and you don't want to be packing at the last second and forget something, right? No one's worried about sudden lava flows overtaking their house or anything like that. We're not in this big mountainous region where like really dramatic things like that can happen. We don't have enormous volcanoes that tower over everything in the landscape and have these steep sides. We just don't have that stuff. The volcanoes are all over the place. If you go to the rooftops in Leon, you can see a dozen of them. Lots of them are active. It's a very real thing. And so the nearest city to any of this is Telica, which is possibly outside the 10-kilometer range, if not right on the edge of it. And the nearest city of any real size is Leon, and we're way outside any danger zone. There's no possibility of that volcano ever doing something that would be really dramatic here. We've heard that it could erupt so much, and it has in the past, that some ash fall comes here. And ash is very inconvenient and does cause you to need to generally pack up and evac, but it's evac kind of like a very slow flood. Like, this is going to cause damage. You're going to have drinking water problems. You need to go. I don't want to go. And you end up staying for days longer than you should and maybe get a little bit sick. And then you realize you should have left. But it's not like suddenly an inundation and you're just washed away, right? This is not Pompeii. We're not within a zone where we're going to be hit by a blast that's going to kill us. We're not in a zone where we're going to be hit by, toxic gases that are going to cause everyone to just not realize they need to leave and just die in their place. None of that can happen. We're in a big, wide open country. And so the level of danger from volcanoes here is extremely low. Now, there was a time when Leon, the city that I live in, was built at the base of a volcano. And people realized just how dumb that was, and they moved it. And that took care of the problem. That's really about it. And then we get these reactions for just about everything here, whether it's volcanoes or earthquakes or hurricanes, all these things that really, I have no idea what people are picturing. Having grown up in the United States, right, we didn't worry about hurricanes. Now, I didn't live in New Orleans, right? I didn't live in Houston. Those places do need to worry about hurricanes. But generally, it's not actually the hurricane they're worried about. It's the storm surge that comes with it and the flooding that causes. If you're in a super low-lying area that's really, really subject to dangerous conditions from flooding, then things that can cause flooding are scary for sure. Generally, you have a lot of warning about it. No one's caught by like, this hurricane snuck up on me, right? People decide to try it out or not, and you're just not in that position of, oh no, what's going to happen. I grew up in New York where that certainly was no risk. We did occasionally get tornadoes or microbursts. Those could be scary, but I don't know anyone who's ever actually dramatically impacted by one. I've been right through an epic microburst, one of the ones that makes the record books, if I see if I get the year right, the 1997 or 1998. They call it the Syracuse microburst or something like that, but it started in Rochester, and that's where I was in the middle of it. And you know, was that interesting? Yeah, super interesting. Was it scary? Maybe at the time a little bit. And one of the more dangerous things that could have happened, but it wasn't that big of a deal, right? A few people were killed in that, but very, very few. And that one was legitimate scary. That's way more dramatic than anything that we ever get here in Nicaragua. And of course, or at least weather related. And I've been through some earthquakes that caused some major damage. Now, one of the reasons that people do get concerned about earthquakes is like in 1972, there was a massive earthquake that completely destroyed Managua. Now, there's a couple things about that, though. One is that it was unprecedented. It was a single, really extreme fluke event, and those things can happen anywhere. It was all over before there was no warning, right? People just suddenly had no city. The second thing is every single city in the region has adjusted because of the potential for that, and everything is built in such a way that that is not a concern. And for most of the places in the region, it never was a concern. Places like Granada and Leon, where I live, are built in places where we could have big earthquakes. Like that is absolutely a risk, and we've had bigger ones than that Managua one since I've lived here, right? So that is very possible. But the thing that got Managua is, one, it was unstable ground between two lakes not that far from the ocean. So it was a spot that specifically didn't have a lot of great underpinnings to keep it super stable. It's also in an area with a lot of really close volcanoes. And it's also a new city where they were building kind of tall with not very good construction standards, things that don't exist anymore. Just like San Francisco was a super big fire hazard in the early 1900s and it burned, right? That's an obvious risk that if people had thought about, they would have realized just how dangerous it was. And some people definitely did realize that. They were not completely caught unawares. They just were caught unprepared, which is not the same thing. But Managua was built using these new techniques to get tall buildings quickly. And no one considered earthquakes because they were just like, we can build a tall building. This is really cool. And then the city liquefied and it was destroyed. And now everything is low-lying like Granada and Leon always have been, with the few exceptions of buildings that are very specifically reinforced for earthquakes. And so today, if that same earthquake or an even quite a bit larger one was to hit Managua, while it would cause a lot of damage to roads and infrastructure, and some buildings would be damaged, the expectation that it would cause massive loss of life and massive homelessness, which is what happened in 72, is all but impossible. Somebody would be impacted pretty dramatically, but the number of people impacted would be in the dozens or hundreds, not in the tens of thousands or possibly hundreds of thousands as it was in 1972. You wouldn't have to build new towns to move people to and things like that. So it's a very different world that we live in, partially because we know how to build things to handle situations, and also because we're aware that those situations can happen. We just live in a different world than those concerns are really appropriate to. The one thing that we do have a risk for, if you live directly on the water in Nicaragua, is that like most places with beaches, there is the risk of tsunamis. But that's true of just beaches. Name a beach in the world on an ocean that doesn't have to worry about tsunamis, right? Every inch of the American coast definitely has to worry about them. Now, some places like the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America as they're now calling it, in North Mexicana, oh my gosh, the name thing is crazy. Yes, their tsunamis are all but impossible. Not completely impossible, but really close to it. In the rest of the world, they're relatively possible. However, even tsunamis, which can happen and are really dramatic, scarier than anything that people actually this is amazing, right? People worry about things that are just not scary. Earthquakes, they're not really scary. It sounds scary. It's interesting to talk about. When it happens, it's really cool that like we felt something here, friends in Managua felt something there. That's cool. Like it's interesting to talk about. We get excited about it happening when we live here. Same thing with the volcanoes. It's like this big shared experience we all have going on at a giant community level. That's really cool. Hey, it's kind of like a giant fireworks display, right? If we put on one of the world's biggest all-time fireworks display in the middle of our town and everyone could see it and everyone could hear it and it was just like this shared experience, that would be really cool, right? And we would all talk about it. That's kind of like what the volcanoes are like. Not that we're all scared about it, not that we're worried about it interrupting our lives. None of that's realistic at all, even with an active eruption happening as I'm talking. I'm in the eruption zone, and this, like, it's silly to think of it as a real concern. But tsunamis are an actual terrifying thing that we have no preventatives for. And so that's where people should be having concerns. If you're going to have some kind of natural disaster concern, that's the one you want to have. And then think about what it realistically means for you. If you don't live on the water, chances are it's meaningless. It only impacts people pretty close to the water. And the chances that it is going to happen remain really low. In all the years that Nicaragua's been here, yes, Las Penitas, where I live, in 1992 took a tragic tsunami that wiped out the entire village. That's real, right? But it's also the only recorded one. So it was a fluke. It happened to be within my lifetime. How much do you base your life decisions around it? Some, yes, but a lot, probably not. It's not a smart way to go. The risks just don't make sense for you to calculate too much based on them. Also, when it happened in 1992, tsunamis were not a well understood phenomenon or not a well predictable phenomenon, and people were constantly being caught in reality, unaware that they were coming, and that is what makes them really scary. Yes, losing your house and stuff, that can be quite scary, so you do want to have some construction thought processes around what you're going to do when this amount of water comes through town. But loss of life is the real concern, right? And tsunamis, if they catch you, tend to do a lot of damage to you personally. But the thing that we now have that we didn't have in 1992 is an entire Pacific Ocean and other places as well, tsunami alert system. If there's a tsunami heading towards Nicaragua, it gets picked up way out in the Pacific. And quite literally, in most cases, it gets picked up as it passes Hawaii. That means we have warning of hours, to the point where we may measure it in parts of it, like, oh, we have half a day, 3/4 of a day of warning. So we got 6 extra feet coming in at Hawaii, and sensors all throughout the Pacific are telling us how fast it's moving, how high the waves are, exactly what to expect. And we have alarm systems, right? We have tsunami alarms that are tested all the time, all up and down the beaches. And so we know those things are going to happen. The only time that we have to worry about a tsunami that can't be picked up by then is the early monitoring system, is if it is a tsunami being generated by a localized earthquake. Those are the scary ones because they can happen really fast. However, it's all but impossible for one of those to happen that you don't feel the earthquake. So everyone is trained. You hear or you feel an earthquake, you go and you look at the water. If you're on the water, you look at it. You can't get a localized tsunami, as far as we know, without the water pulling away from shore. So if it doesn't pull away from shore, there's nothing to generate that tsunami if the earthquake was truly localized. So there's a lot of different things that come into this with a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of preparedness, a little bit of being actively observant and knowing what to do, and realizing that the world has become a really safe place in general. There's not that much to actually worry about. But certainly, if you're not worried about tsunamis, you shouldn't be worried about the other things. Like hurricanes, people say to me all the time, there's an hurricane coming in. I don't know if I want to be in that country. I'm scared of all these things. Why? And I really mean this. All of these things, what makes people feel scared about them? Now, I understand, like, if you live in California, there's fears of major earthquakes because it's a really seismically active zone. It's very specific worldwide that California is in a lot of risk for earthquakes compared to anywhere else. Other places get earthquakes all the time, but no one worries about it. It's just a very casual thing. But in California, they're dangerous. I'm not saying that Californians are like reacting weird to earthquakes. They actually have a lot of danger from earthquakes. Mexico City is the same because it's built on sludge. Like they've got some construction problems that create some major problems with that. So these things exist, but they're very isolated. They're unique places that have these problems. Just like we don't worry about there being a brush fire. We do worry about people's roofs catching on fire, and like localized fires are obviously a real thing. We have fire departments and try to keep them funded like anywhere else. But in California, and I say this as California is having one of its most epic wildfires of all time, and Los Angeles is burning, people are really afraid of fires for good reason, because they burn on a scale that nowhere else does. So yes, if you're looking at the world from a California perspective, a lot of these things, including tsunamis, are big risks and very scary for them. But California is very uniquely a natural disaster hotspot worldwide. And we need to ignore that and think about what would you be concerned about if you're talking about Iowa, Pennsylvania, Alberta, Scotland, right? All these places get tornadoes. All these places get, big storms or big earthquakes or whatever. They always happen. Everywhere in the world pretty much gets them from time to time. But in most of the world, we don't sit around worrying about them. What do people think is going to happen? If we have the most epic volcanic eruptions here, we're not in any danger. If we have the biggest earthquakes that are ever recorded in the region, we're not in any real danger. If we have the biggest hurricane that has ever happened, it's just going to be really rainy, with the exception of the big hurricanes with a truly epic amount of rainfall can, in regions that aren't here, right, up in the mountains, can cause landslides, right, mudslides. That does happen to pretty much anywhere that has mountains. We have volcanic mountains all over the place. They specifically are more susceptible to landslides because that's not as well set. Like, it's a very loose siding to the mountains, and so to have that liquefy and flow is much more likely, right? But beyond that, none of the things that people worry about here are on any Nicaraguan's radar as things to worry about. Like, it really baffles me, because it's not unique to Nicaragua that these things aren't scary. It's that you have to work really hard to find places where they are scary. That is definitely the exception, not the rule. Most places don't care about any of those things because they just don't impact them. So let's talk about these hurricanes, because people don't tend to really understand this well. So hurricanes come from the warm water of the Caribbean. That's basically where all hurricanes are going to generate. So in order to have a hurricane, first of all, a lot of things got to come together. And here in Nicaragua, we get hurricanes on a decently regular basis. I'm not going to say we're like a magnet for them, but we are in an area that gets them with some frequency, and that's fine, right? You're going to be in the Caribbean, you're going to get big tropical storms. There's no getting around that. So we have these hurricanes, and they come to Nicaragua from time to time. And I think we've been through maybe 3 since we've lived here, so getting like 1 per season is a very rough average in the little observational time that we've had. So that's reasonable. So you get these hurricanes, and they come from the Caribbean, and the warmer the water, the stronger they are. Things that kill a hurricane is when your water is cold or you don't have any water. Once you're on land, hurricanes just peter out really quickly. And if you don't have storm surge, right, that's caused by the low pressure of the center of the hurricane sucking up water, it actually raises the water level. That's where the flooding comes from, right? Very rarely do you get flooding from hurricane rains. You may get localized flooding, like a river gets tall or whatever, but in general, the scary bits is when it actually raises the ocean, raises the bay or whatever near where it's making landfall, and then those communities may be underwater, maybe not very far, but a few inches or maybe a foot or two underwater simply because of storm surge, and that causes massive damage and can cut communities off from escape, for example. So that's what you worry about with hurricanes. If you live in a place that's on high ground, hurricanes are basically not scary. If you live in a place inland where storm surge can't get to, hurricanes are pretty hard to find a reason for them to be scary. They can have those really high winds, but those winds are not like a tornado. It is extremely rare, under the most extreme circumstances, that a hurricane is going to get to a point where it can like blow your house away and then you could be swept away with it. In order for it to reach those conditions, basically it has to be on the shore, and it has to be on a warm shore where it is coming ashore. It can't be on some place it makes its way to, right? Understanding the dynamic of a hurricane, it only has power and function when it's over warm water. So as soon as a hurricane reaches Nicaragua, remember, our Caribbean coast is essentially empty. Now, if you're talking to people on the Caribbean coast, you're talking to Bluefields, you're talking to Bilwi, places like that, Pearl Lagoon, are they scared of hurricanes? Are they concerned about them? Absolutely. And are they building their houses on stilts? Because while they can't get tsunamis being in the Caribbean, like, I don't know any physical way they could. Maybe they can, but it's not a real concern, that's for sure. But they can get storm surge from hurricanes. So they are built on stilts in many cases, or their houses are very, very throwaway and just designed to be blown away and put back together easily. They take a different approach because they're really concerned about hurricanes, and they worry about their safety and they worry about their possessions. That's real, but that's also a tiny population zone that is nothing like what we show and talk about as Nicaragua. And not that there's anything wrong with, because a lot of my audience has a lot of interest in being on the Caribbean coast. By all means, if that's something you're interested in, for sure, they need an influx of expats out there to help shore up their economy, no pun intended, for sure. Right, that's fantastic. Definitely consider that, and I want to go out and do a lot of filming there, and it's really interesting in a different cultural region. But importantly, everything you see on my show, everything we talk about as the culture and the landscape and the lifestyle and just the things you see of Nicaragua is the Pacific Coast, the traditional Nicaraguan population area. That area is extremely far from the Caribbean coast. If a hurricane was to come directly across Nicaragua, come onto the Caribbean coast, come on at Bilwi, cross the jungle, go over the mountains, and come to populated Nicaragua, Managua, Grenada, Leon, and so forth. One, it has to come on land. There's no body of water for it to travel over to get here. So it's going to be traveling over the world's second largest rainforest. That's a massive zone. A truly epic zone for a hurricane to move over without water to feed it. So being over land alone would just wipe it out. From a distance perspective, this would be as if you had a hurricane come on land at like Philadelphia and you were living in Pittsburgh. And I've never heard of anyone, and I lived in Pittsburgh, right? I've never heard of anyone who had the slightest inkling of a fear that a hurricane could matter to them. Right? They know about hurricanes and they know that a hurricane could mean a big rainy day, right? But it's not something where you worry about like, we're going to get a hurricane. It just isn't something you worry about because you're so far inland that anything called a hurricane by the time it gets to you isn't even a tropical storm. It's just a lot of rain. And a lot of rain is generally a good thing, not generally a bad thing for most places. So not too concerned about it, right? So think of Nicaragua kind of like Pittsburgh, close enough to the coast that it's within a state that has coastline, but so far away that the idea of a hurricane even being recognized as a hurricane from there is so absurd that it's never happened in human history and never will, right? So that kind of perspective. And think about early Pennsylvania, not now, being all trees, not that the trees matter. Anything that's over land is going to, but that hurricane is just going to dissipate and not have the characteristics of a hurricane by the time it gets to Pittsburgh. Then, unlike Pittsburgh, in order for it to get past that jungle in Nicaragua, it has to go over our Cordillera, which is our portion of the Rocky Mountains. Now, that makes it sound a lot higher than it is. They're very old, low mountains. So this is not a super tall thing. Like the actual Rockies would simply stop every hurricane ever. But in this area, yes, a hurricane-like storm can, in theory, make its way over the mountains. But if you think that this huge expanse of jungle has wiped out a lot of the hurricane, the mountains take 99% of what's left out, right? It's extremely hard for a swirling storm to make it through rugged mountain terrain, right? Because it's not just not getting water, and it's not just being warm, it is now cool, dry air, which is completely wiping it out, and that basically turns into a big friction zone, so the swirling motion has a really hard time continuing. Now, if it's able to get over those mountains and come into populated Western Nicaragua, you now have an area where the storm has been over land for a really long time and it has no access to water. So you have, at best, a really weak, large rainstorm and no possibility of storm surge because in order to generate storm surge, it has to get past all of this area and get out over the Pacific, and which is really cold, not warm. So you don't get hurricanes in that portion of the Pacific. You don't get cyclones either. And then it would have to somehow generate a bunch of power, generate storm surge, and pick it. It doesn't happen, right? No storm makes it that far. I've been out and filmed in hurricanes when they've come here. Right? And it's interesting because it is a strong storm. And we're able to show what it's like here in Leon when we have that much water coming down all at once with those high winds. And everyone's talking about it because the Caribbean coast, right, shared cultural experience, they've been getting pounded out there because they sit on the water, right? They have all that storm surge. They have all that strong winds. We just have a big rainy storm, but it's like our solidarity with other parts of the country that, hey, we're in this too. We're not in any risk, but we're participating as best we can. And do you want to go out with an umbrella? Yeah, sometimes. Do trees get uprooted from time to time? Yes, I filmed one when that happened. But are we scared? Is it a big deal? No, it is not. There's no possibility, not within any realm of reason, that a big storm like that coming from the Caribbean could ever have a dangerous impact on us here in the populated areas. Plus, many of our towns are in the mountains, so just those ideas aren't there. Again, heavy rain can make for mudslides, but that can happen without those kinds of storms. So in all these cases, these things that people worry about, and people really do worry, I'm constantly being asked, like, well, should I not come to the country? It sounds so scary. And you're like, how? It's like describing Iowa and then people being like, I'm scared of the earthquakes, volcanoes, and hurricanes in Iowa, right? Based on the fact that, yes, New Orleans can get hurricanes and California can get earthquakes and Oregon can get volcanoes that are unpredictable. And when you put all those things together and say it's in the United States, it sounds like the whole U.S. is this big, scary natural disaster haven. And then you add in this tornado thing to it, which does happen in Iowa, and it's just terrifying, right? But the reality is that none of those things can get to Iowa. And to live in the United States and to think of volcanoes or earthquakes or hurricanes as being really scary things is an outlier. It exists, but it's an outlier. It is not the norm. Here in Nicaragua, it's more of an outlier. All those things are common. We get all of them all the time. But the amount that anybody's actually really impacted by them, except for the Caribbean coast by the hurricanes, is nominal. Right, it is an extreme rarity, and so that's and before I lived in Nicaragua, I didn't feel that any of these things would be scary here. Knowing kind of what the landscape is like, right? In order for any of these things to be scary, you need specific conditions, and so nowhere you go in the world do you really need to sit around and think about these on a normal basis. If you are going to go to a place that specifically has problems with some of these things, normally you're alerted to it quite a bit ahead of time. Examples are southeastern Sicily or the Naples region of Italy. Italy specifically has some of the world's most dangerous volcanic situations. In those places, typically you are well aware that you're going to be on the foothills of Vesuvius or the base of Vesuvius, or that you're going to be on Sicily, which is a volcanic island and people are often trapped near Etna or whatever, right? So living in that area is very specifically a danger for for volcanoes, and people are aware of it. If you are going to be living in California, you're very aware that earthquakes are specifically a thing. If you're going to be in Mexico City, you're very aware, very specifically, earthquakes are a thing. But you can go to other parts of the United States, other parts of Mexico, and they're not, right? It's just those spots. And so it is something that I think people need to think about anywhere they're going, is not to react and say, oh, there must be natural disasters that I need to be afraid of. That is the exception, not the rule. And you just really have to struggle to come up with ways to scare yourself, I think, in a lot of these cases. And, maybe at a time where it feels like the media whips up a frenzy about every little thing, and not to downplay this incredible firestorm that is going on in California right now. That is incredibly tragic. That is a really big deal and a special case. And that's not what I'm talking about. When we have any little thing anywhere in the world, the media makes it all sound like it's such a big thing. And the reality is that very rarely is it. And places that you're going to go as an expat and places you're going to go as a tourist are not places where these things are a big fear. Generally, when there are these isolated problems, it's almost always really poor neighborhoods, very isolated communities. Countries are not putting major population centers. They're definitely not putting major tourist centers near areas that are at risk, unless it is that risk itself that is the tourism you're going to see. If you want to go visit, and this is funny because I talked with my daughter about this today, if you want to go visit Pompeii, hopefully you have a fair understanding that if you are going to go to the remnants of a massive natural disaster, you are at some risk of that natural disaster happening again while you're there. Unlikely, of course, it goes thousands of years without occurring, but it did happen a couple thousand years ago. It could happen again, and this exact spot that you're in Pompeii is obviously at least at risk. We can't say that it's more prone than other places. We don't know after 100 cycles of this eruption, is this actually the place or was it a fluke? We don't know, but we know it could possibly happen there, because if it happened once, it can happen again. So when you're going to be doing natural disaster tourism, yes, that's an exception. But normal places that you're going to go, places that you're going to live, places that other people are looking to live, are not these places at risk. And so I don't want to beat a dead horse, but it just comes up so often that there's clearly a belief in the world being a lot scarier as a global weather and geologic phenomenon than it actually is. And so here we are in the middle of this volcanic eruption. We are enjoying it. It is interesting to have happen. We do hope that everyone in those communities that are nearby stays safe and that they stay alert and do the smart things. But we don't have any anticipation that even if it is much worse than anticipated, that it is going to actually be at risk for any amount of human life or even housing or construction or whatever. It's just not things we actually have to worry about here in the real world. We could worry about things like ashfall, which are inconvenient but not deadly because it's so far away. You get so much warning. You just leave, come back after it's stopped falling out of the air. Like, it's very easy to deal with. Inconvenient, of course. And I've been here when cities have been shut down because of the ashfall, but they had lots of warning. They know exactly what to do. And no one got hurt. Right? It just interrupts traffic and the cleaning crews have to go out and get the town ready for people to return. Yeah, that can cause problems, but it's not something to be scared of, right? In so many things, right? We're taught, because it sells views, because it makes money, because it's good for a lot of not good for us reasons. Creating fear, encouraging people to be fearful of everything in the world is powerful and encouraged. And it's time we all step back and say, you know what? We don't need to be afraid of so many things. There are things to be unhappy about. There's things to be concerned about. There are things worth being afraid about. But if we let ourselves give in to all kinds of fears and just live fearing everything, we lose all of our freedoms and powers and ability to control our own lives and to enjoy them when often we're afraid of things that are never really going to happen, extremely unlikely, and maybe importantly, completely out of our control. Any amount of living here in Nicaragua in the middle of the ring of fire, none of it is ever going to be as scary as living in very stable, nothing ever happens upstate New York, where we actually had a major earthquake that caused a lot of damage when I was a kid. No one saw that coming, never happened before, it's never going to happen again. That one event just happened. No amount of worrying, no amount of prevention would ever have made a difference, because we would just as likely have moved to someplace even more dangerous and taken even more risk that it would have happened. So yeah, don't worry about coming to Nicaragua. This is actually one of the safest places. If you want to be completely safe, don't live directly on the beach. Stay far enough out that a tsunami would not get to you. And then just go to the beach, which can be walking distance, into the tsunami zone. So you just have to walk away. That's all you have to do. And be alert and listen for sirens. Know that if you feel an earthquake, to look at the water. And beyond that, you don't have any realistic risks in any populated part of Nicaragua. It's one of the safest natural disaster areas that you're going to reasonably find. I'm not saying that the natural disasters are even less here than Iowa, but in reality, because I don't have to worry about tornadoes, I think it probably is. Anyway, thanks for joining me. Like and subscribe. If you'd like to help support the channel, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Scott Allen Miller. You can get down those comments, send in a video of your own questions, or just leave questions and comments in the comment section. We appreciate that as well. Tell a friend about the show. Subscribe, do all that stuff, and I will see all of you tomorrow.